Okay, we're on. Hello out there in Zoom land. We have Catherine D'Amico and Coty Keller again with the Interfaith Association of Greater Long Beach. This is session number 3 of our This Fragile Earth, Our Island Home series. Okay. Tonight, the topic is bold action. And I think it's wise if we put this into context with the whole program. Last week, we talked about the problem. We talked about how the natural world is out of balance because of mankind's activity. We've filled the atmosphere with just more greenhouse gases than the system can handle without heating up. And this week, we're going to talk about the bold action that needs to be achieved if we're going to get nature back in balance. And it's important to recognize that this week we're only going to talk about what the ends are, what we need to do, and not how it's going to get done and who's going to do it, which is the topic of sessions 4 and 5. Next week we'll talk about who does what in our own realms, and then in session 5 we'll talk about government. So this week it's all about what needs to be achieved without regard to who and how we're going to do it, which are good questions, but we'll have to put those off till next week. So for tonight, here's the agenda. I'll offer a basic framework for what has to be done. I'll offer some caveats, some pitfalls that we want to be careful of. Then we'll spend the most of the night talking about the means, the 6 things that need to be achieved if we're going to avoid exceeding the 1.5 degree centigrade threshold that we talked about last week. And we'll talk about uncertainty. What are we going to do about the things that we can't determine and that we just don't know? Then we'll summarize. Then we'll have a question and answer session. Oh, and by the way, Wendy Goldstein's going to be joining us about 2/3 of the way through tonight. And Wendy will be with us running the question and answer tonight. So if a stranger pops up about slide number 15 or so, that's Wendy. And then we'll talk about what's next, what's coming in the latter part of the program, and what we can look forward to for next week. Okay, so here's the basic framework. There's a picture of it and there's some words. In the picture, you can see in the top, that's really the problem, is the 400 plus parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that's what's causing the problem. I mean, that really is the problem. And we have on the right in green, the solutions that take that carbon out of the atmosphere. And on the left, we have in red, the emissions that we have to reduce. So there's 2 parts to this. There's what's going up that has to be reduced, the reduced emissions. And this is a consensus of almost all the scientists in the world, in the US and around the world, in terms of the magnitude and the scope of the reductions. We're talking about 70 to 100% reductions in the next decade. That's really dramatic. That's about almost 8% annual reduction in emissions. And you'll see we'll develop these thoughts tonight. There's 2 things that have to happen to achieve this. One is conservation. We have to use less energy, and then we have to make the transition. The energy that we're using, we have to transition from using fossil fuels to zero emission fuels. Then there's the other side of the coin, sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere. We're talking about something on the order of magnitude of 140 gigatons. A gigaton is 1 billion tons of carbon that has to come out of the atmosphere. And again, it's a 2-part process. Part of that has to be from reforestation or making forests where we didn't have them, which is afforestation. And we also have to have better soil management. because that's where we're going to store the carbon. Okay, that's the basic framework. Before we get into the specifics of what we need to achieve, in our quest to find and implement solutions to the climate crisis, we'd do well to avoid a few potential pitfalls. And here they are. The adaptation and mitigation dilemma, this nonsense about saving the planet, and also these misleading adjectives that we use, the terms clean and renewable. They're worthy of our caution and our understanding. Some of you may have heard these two terms when we talk about fixing the climate problem, adaptation and mitigation. The distinction is very important. And on the left, we have the definitions from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Adaptation is the process of adjusting to actual or expected climate change. This is building dikes, elevating buildings, and things like that. Whereas mitigation is human intervention to reduce heat trapping emissions or remove carbon already in the air. The key here is lately, especially in places like Florida, the focus is exclusively on adaptation. You may have heard all the tooting about resiliency. And while it's important to adapt and make us resilient, the climate's going to still change, and the long-term impact of global warming is going to be too severe to manage. Bill Gates, in his latest book on the climate crisis, says adaptation is not a solution. It's important that we recognize that we have to do both. We have to mitigate if we're going to solve the problem. No amount of adaptation is going to do it. We have to do both. Sometimes we hear this phrase, save the planet, and it's as if it's some kind of a noble pursuit. But consider the view of the founder of this spaceship Earth, David Hole, who wrote this quote here. Whoever uses this phrase, he says, quite untactfully, is clueless about climate change. If saving the planet is said by a corporation, they're greenwashing. If an individual says this term, they're uninformed. Earth has existed for billions of years and will continue to exist for billions more. Humanity is facing an existential crisis. To think the planet needs to be saved by humanity is just anthropomorphic hubris. Now think about what we know about the climate crisis and the history of the Earth. Our planet's going to survive no matter how bad we heat it up. Perhaps we should be describing our pursuit in different terms besides save the planet. As the faith leaders told us in session 1, we are called on to be stewards of God's creation and called on to turn away from behavior that alters the Earth's climate and puts our world's poor and most vulnerable at risk. All faiths are bound by teachings to care for the natural world. God gave us this perfectly balanced natural system, as the Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley told us. Instead of saying we plan to save the planet, we could say, as Sir David Attenborough does, our aim is to restore the balance, to restore the natural world so that all species, including humans, can continue to exist. This is my favorite gripe. We have these misleading adjectives. People all the time are saying, let's use more clean natural gas. Well, we know natural gas is anything but clean. well, maybe it's a little bit better than coal, but what happens when you use natural gas? Emissions go up into the air. Methane can be leaking, causing even worse catastrophes than coal does. Natural gas is anything but clean, but all the time people are saying, let's get clean energy. It's just, it's very misleading. We have the same thing with renewables. Clean and renewable energy is going to save everything. Well, think about some renewable fuels, wood, biofuels, ethanol, biodiesel. What happens when you burn these fuels is emissions are caused. And in the case of ethanol and biodiesel, the idea initially was, well, that since you're growing these things, they're going to store some carbon in the soil and take carbon dioxide out of the air. So in the end, it'll all be neutral. But as it works out with ethanol, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, and with biodiesel, by the time you have all the mechanical processes of creating these fuels and transporting it, and then burning it, it winds up being almost as bad as the other fossil fuels. So the real thing we need to be shooting for is not clean and renewable. We need to be shooting for zero emissions. We want to be talking about using fuel energy sources like solar, wind, nuclear, small hydro, and geothermal energy that meet the criteria that we really need for bold action, and that is zero emissions. I'd suggest we delete clean and renewable from our vocabulary, or at least we can't stop other people from using them. When you hear those terms, please take them with a grain of salt and replace them with zero emissions. Okay, let's get to the 6 means that we need to achieve to make this happen. And then we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. We need to plant a lot of trees. We need to reduce our energy consumption, which is a concept I'll talk about in a minute. And then we need to electrify almost everything. That is, generate power from non-emitting power sources. I'm sorry. We need to electrify everything. That is, we want to use electricity to power almost everything. And then the electricity we use should all be from zero emission sources. We need to improve the food system. We need to transition to a finite Earth economy, and I'll explain what that means. And then we need to get corporations out of the way so we can restore our democracy by abolishing corporate personhood. Let's talk about each one of these things in detail. Okay. Sir David Attenborough says that reforestation is the best tool that taking carbon out of the air. Indeed, the Project Drawdown says that reforestation is number 5 out of 100 solutions for drawing down global warming. Afforestation, which is the creation of new forests where none were exist before, is also an important thing to do. It's listed as number 15 on out of 100 by Project Drawdown. This graph on the right is an illustration of a project that the Florida Veterans for Common Sense and the Rotary are doing. This is taking an area in a otherwise unused part of a park in Sarasota, Florida, and creating a little microforest. It's about 1/3 of an acre, and it was really a demonstration. But you can see in about 10 years, this is going to be storing a lot of carbon in the ground and more carbon in the trees itself. It's a very small project. What we need, of course, is millions and millions of projects, but reforestation is a main thing to do. And we'll talk next week about how we can do that as individuals, and then in the following week, how we can do that as government. The concept of reducing energy consumption is really important. And this is a graphic description. And the top two lines here, we have two curves. We have the energy consumption curve. The one on the top is how it's going now. And then the energy consumption curve down here is where we want to get it, is to bring the consumption curve down. You'll see why it's important in a minute. By efficiency and conservation. Efficiency, examples of efficiency are light emitting diodes. They just happen to use electricity, use less power than others. Conservation is the other way to reduce consumption. Example of that is just turn the light switch off. So there's the consumption curve and bring it down. Here's why it's important. The other curve here is the transition curve, or the zero emission energy adaptation curve. So let's say here's where we are now, slowly transitioning from fossil fuels to zero emission energy. And by the old energy conservation curve, you can see that where we get to energy or zero emission energy is somewhere out here, maybe 50 years away. But by drawing down the consumption curve and then speeding up the transition, you can see how the combination of that two might make things happen 25 years sooner. But the conceptual issue here is reducing energy consumption. And that's an important part of the program, very essential. Because we can transition all we want, but unless we get the consumption curve down, it's going to be forever before we get to zero emission energy. The next part of what we need to achieve is really cool. This is like the technical breakthrough, or the technical aspect of this, is that we need to basically switch over to electrify just about everything. And what do I mean? What are the exceptions? I'll talk about that in a minute. And then generate the power from non-emitting energy sources. Part of the reason we want to do this is because electricity is such a much more efficient way of doing things than other machinery. So we can almost reduce energy consumption by almost 50% just by switching to electricity. About an estimate is about 10% of that reduction comes just from electric motors being more efficient than fossil fuel motors. They don't use as much energy, or as much energy is not wasted. Also, shifting from fossil fuel power to renewable energy, or to zero emission energy, saves another 15%. Just think about carbon-free, non-thermal power sources like wind, solar, hydro. They're not wasting all that energy and heat like fossil fuels do. Electrifying transportation saves about another 15%. Our Nissan Leaf, about 85% of the energy that comes out of the battery gets to the tires, gets to the wheels, gets the car moving. A typical fossil fuel or gas-fired car, we're lucky if 20% of the energy that you're burning from the fossil fuels gets to the wheels. And then electrifying buildings gets us about another 6, 8, 9%. And you add that all up, and you're talking about a 50% reduction in consumption just by switching to electricity. And then in terms of zero emission power, where does it come from? Wind turbines, solar farms, geothermal, nuclear power, rooftop solar, small hydropower. And these numbers in parentheses here are the numbers of the project drawdown assigns to these different means of electrical generation in terms of the relative power they hold out of the 100 solutions for drawing down global warming. Wind turbines, there's two numbers here because we have land farms or wind farms on land, and we have wind farms at sea, 2 and 22 respectively. Solar farms are the industrial grade farms that the utility companies build, and number 8 out of 100. Geothermal, we don't have too much in our regions, but around the world, geothermal is overall number 18. Nuclear power, number 20. Rooftop solar, number 10. Our national research lab says that we could, if everybody had solar on the roof, it would take care of about 40% of the United States electricity needs. And then small hydropower. Why not regular hydropower? Regular hydropower is very damaging for other ecosystems. Dams don't allow fish, it kills people. Small hydropower are small local units that don't interfere with the rest of the ecology. Now, these, if you're interested in learning more about each of these technologies, you can look in the reference section for tonight's session, which I'll send you the link to in an email tomorrow. Or you can go to the resource page for our program and for session 3. And there's a detailed link here to the details of this in the Project Drawdown document. Okay, so I'm talking about electrifying almost everything. Well, what don't we want to electrify? Project Drawdown recommends that we really think about heating water with the sun. And I think this picture here is our solar water heater in Freeport, New York. So we talk about solar, people may always think about solar electric, but you can use solar energy to heat the water. And heating water is a major energy use. Worldwide, about 1/4 of residential energy use is in heating water, and in commercial applications, about 12%. So just think about, if you can heat your water with the sun, you can cut somewhere between 12 and 25% of your energy use. Another way to reduce your energy consumption. And it's also a very cost-effective way to do it. Some people get 2 to 4 year paybacks. We get a 25% return on investment on our solar water system. I don't want to say it's cheap, but it pays you good return on investment. Okay. Improving the food system. We're going to spend a good amount of time on this now. You may recall from last week talking about the problem that about 25% of human emissions are caused by the result of the food system. The other problem with our food system is because our roots are so shallow and because we do so little to work with the soil, we're losing all sorts of opportunities in our food system to sequester carbon. So Project Drawdown offers many solutions for improving our food system. It's really surprising that the top 2 have to do with human behavior and not with farming practice. Reducing food waste and a plant-rich diet are number 8 and number 4 on the list of drawdown solutions for fixing the climate change problem. I'm sorry, number 3 and number 4, right at the top of the list. So just think about it. 8% of global emissions are the result of reducing food waste. And we can do a lot about that, and we'll talk about that next week when we talk about what individuals can do including reducing food waste. And we'll talk about how shifting to a plant-based diet can reduce emissions significantly, and not to mention what it can do for your health and for productivity. So behavior changes are radical. And farming practices are also important, and we're going to talk about that for a minute, maybe more than a minute. These 4 farming practices that are listed here, silvopasture, and again, the number in parentheses is the number out of 100 in the Project Drawdown assessment of the best ways to draw down climate to global warming. Regenerative agriculture, composting, and then getting rid of fertilizers. Let's just talk about those quickly. Silvopasture is an ancient practice that integrates trees, pasture or grazing, and forage into a single ecosystem. Kind of like you see in the picture here. You have trees, you have cows, all working together, and the result is more carbon into the soil and happier cows. Regenerative agriculture is actually a farming practice that's practiced by the farmers in my family. And it's really an awesome concept, because conventional wisdom has long held that the world cannot be fed without chemicals and synthetic fertilizers. But evidence points to new wisdom. The world cannot be fed unless the soil is fed. Regenerative agriculture enhances and sustains the health of the soil by restoring its carbon content, which in turn improves productivity. Just the opposite of conventional agriculture. You can read more about it by clicking on the reference, but basically we're talking about several practices. We're not tilling the soil anymore, because tilling the soil releases the carbon in the soil. It also messes up all the micro, all the life in the soil. We're going to use diverse cover crops. We're not going to use external nutrients. We'll let the natural fertilization process take care of itself. No pesticides or synthetic fertilizers, and then multiple crop rotations. All that good stuff is what makes up regenerative agriculture. Composting, you've probably all have heard about. Can go from anything from your backyard bins to industrial scale operations. Regardless of how you do it, it converts organic waste into soil carbon. And you're averting landfills and enriching the soil. And finally, fertilizer nutrient management is really important. Over the years, fertilizers have vastly improved the productive capacity of agricultural systems, but some of the synthetic nitrogen is taken in by the crops and increases growth and yield. The nitrogen that's not utilized by the plants, however, causes untold problems. You're chemically destroying organic matter in the soil. It's seeping into waterways, creating algae blooms and loss of oxygen, creating dead zones in our waterways. And it's causing global warming. As soil bacteria converts nitrate fertilizers into nitrous oxide. You might remember that from last week. It's 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in its warming effect. So nitrogen can be managed to some degree. They have the 4 R's, right? The right source, the right time, the right place, the right amount. The true solution to nutrient management, however, is rotational, regenerative land practices that eliminate most, if not all, the need for synthetic nitrogen. really want to get rid of fertilizers and instead use regenerative agriculture, composting, and silvopasture to feed the soil. Okay, there's great opportunities in the food system, in changing our behaviors, getting rid of food waste, shifting to a plant-based diet, and the farming practices that we just talked about. Well, that's it for the food system. Let's move on to fixing the economy. The next is the need for a finite Earth economy. Well, what's wrong with our economy, you might say? The stock market has been soaring. Other than a few hiccups for a pandemic, gross domestic product, GDP, has been growing. What's wrong? Well, what's wrong is that with the status quo, almost according to United Way, almost half of Americans are in dire financial straits. Between poverty and people living paycheck to paycheck, it amounts, at least in the state of Florida, to about 45% of our population, 45% of households. And I know that statistic pretty well stands up nationwide. Ecologically, we're consuming more than our share. The people from this planet Earth explain that by July of each year, we have used up the allotted resources in terms of water, oxygen, carbon emissions, then we're allowed for a whole year. We're also, as we know, we're feeding the climate crisis. We've got our natural systems all out of midst. We have an economy that's dependent on fossil fuels, deforestation, and bad agricultural practices. And finally, the way we measure a healthy economy, gross domestic product, or GDP, does not What's happening, Wendy? Are you seeing weird things happening?
It flickered for a second, but now it's still on the finite Earth economy slide.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, my screen was going nuts.
No, it just flickered for a second.
Okay. GDP doesn't measure enhancements in life or satisfaction. It doesn't measure poverty or how we protect the environment. The idea is to move to a new economy, a finite Earth economy that has these characteristics. We don't reward bad behavior. We don't have any more subsidies for fossil fuels and people who poison our agriculture. Instead, we punish bad behavior by putting a price on carbon. We reward good behavior. We pay people, we pay farmers to sequester carbon. We provide good paying jobs in green energy areas. And we have new metrics. We have ways of measuring economic success that have to do with life expectancy, people earning a living wage, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and education. And oh, by the way, let's not overlook the economic benefits of reducing emissions. Zero emission energy is already, well, let's look what happens if we don't.
You're on mute. You're muted, Coty. Let me see if I can unmute you. There you go. It looks like you're back.
I'm back.
You're back. And if you,
Rough evening here. Okay.
yeah, yeah, and now your slide's back too.
Thank you. Okay. Doing nothing or too little to mitigate climate is going to threaten the whole economy. And zero emission energy is already cost competitive, if not outright cheaper than fossil fuels. And solar and wind energy are returning a healthy return on investment. And not to mention, we have the health benefits from reducing pollution. No smokestacks, no tailpipes, translates to dollars and lives saved. And then the final of the 6 elements is the need to abolish corporate personhood. I'm going to abbreviate this because we're running behind time because of my technical difficulties here. Basically, we have given up our constitutional rights to corporations based on Supreme Court decisions and precedents in the late 1800s. And money, as a result of the Citizens United decision in 2010, money is treated as free speech. So what happens is real people, real persons are disempowered, and it's not a democracy anymore. The solution is to have an amendment to the Constitution that says that constitutional rights are only to be held by natural persons and not corporations, and that spending money on elections is not to be considered protected free speech. There is a soon to be introduced amendment before the Congress that does just this, and it's called the We the People Amendment. We should be reading about that being reintroduced at the 117th Congress shortly. We need to get the corporations having an outlandish amount of say if we're going to be able to do anything about not only the environment, but anything else in our democracy. Okay. Finally, we need to address uncertainty. We don't want to fail to make a decision about making bold action because we don't have all the information. And some people will say, well, why should we go to all this trouble and all this expense when other people may not take action, or the other people in the world would fail to make decisions. So one way we can do this is a decision science tool where we lay out what we can control and what we can't control in a matrix. And then what we want to do is make a decision based on achieving the best case and avoiding the worst case. So the situation we have now is we're looking about whether we want to decide to take bold action or not. So over here on the left-hand side, we have our choices. We do not act, or we do take action. And what's uncertain is what the rest of the world does. The rest of the world, which we don't have any idea what they're going to do, they can take action or not take action. So we want to lay this out and say, okay, if we don't take any action and others take action, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to blow through the 1.5 degree centigrade threshold for sure, but it's probably going to happen later than if nobody takes any action. If the other countries in the world don't take action and we don't take action, that's the worst case. We're going to blow through the threshold like nothing, probably by 2040 from the information that we had last week. If we decide to take bold action and the others in the world take bold action, then that's the best case. We're going to have a chance to keep global average temperatures below the 1.5 degree centigrade threshold, which is going to give us a chance to maintain life as we know it. Then also what's going to happen is we're going to have all the economic and health benefits from transitioning ourselves to a zero emission economy. If we take bold action and the others don't, what's happening here? The world's going to blow through the 1.5 degree threshold, but probably at a later date than if nobody took action. But we're still going to have the economic and health benefits of zero emission energy. So if we take bold action, we're going to make the best case available. If we don't take bold action, we're going to make it possible for the worst case to happen. So even though we don't know what the rest of the world's going to do and what the ultimate outcome is going to be, it makes sense for us to take bold action. That way we have a chance for the best case, and we're going to avoid the worst case. Okay, so we can summarize what we need to achieve to give ourselves a chance in this fight is to become nature's biggest ally. We talked about the numbers before. They're staggering. 70 to 100% emissions reductions in the next 10 years and removing a whole lot of carbon from the atmosphere. We want to make sure we mitigate and not just adapt. We should probably forget this term, save the planet, and would do ourselves a favor by not talking about clean and renewable energy because it's confusing. Let's just talk about zero emission energy. And we're going to achieve this by planting a lot of trees, reducing consumption, electrifying almost everything, improving the food system, switching to a finite earth economy and abolishing corporate personhood, and dealing with uncertainty by taking the path that'll give us a chance for the best case scenario. All right.
Okay.
So,
we have about 4 or 5 questions that I will share with you now. The first you touched on earlier in the lecture, but the question was asked, so let's just share it. Betsy Hill asked, is burning wood bad for the environment?
yes. Any other questions? Yeah, let's talk about that. Wood is considered a biofuel of sorts, or biomass. When that tree is growing, it's doing good things. It's sequestering carbon. What's bad about wood is that it contributes to the problem we see over here on the left side of the situation. The wood is producing carbon dioxide when it burns. Depending upon how the wood was harvested, it may have disrupted the soil. So generally speaking, we want to stay away from wood because it, like biofuels, other biofuels, it produces greenhouse gases.
Okay. And while you were talking about not using words and phrases like save the planet, Diana typed in, I always say, save the life on this planet. Earth will abide no matter what we do.
Say that again, and everybody listen to it. That's really insightful, Diana. Thank you.
Save the life on this planet. Earth will abide no matter what we do.
Very good. Thank you, Diana.
And then we have a couple of others. Keith Waltz asked, with regard to the climate crisis, is this what's happening in Texas, a polar vortex as a result of global warming?
I'm not sure what the question is. One of the issues that I heard in Texas was people are blaming renewable energy on the blackouts. That's an interesting one. The polar vortex, this is new information to me. If I have it right, what I read in the New York Times today, and then I heard on the news last night also, as people say, well, it's so cold, this proves that global warming isn't happening. And actually and then IMAD emailed me an article about this today too. The reason that we're having this cold is that the polar vortex, which is this circular motion around the poles that generally keeps the cold air in the north, the polar vortex has been disturbed by a shift in the jet stream that's been caused by global warming. So I haven't read it on this extensively, but the news that I'm reading the last 2 days is the global warming has affected the strength of the jet stream, which is impacting on its ability or degrading its ability to keep the polar vortex intact, which has allowed the frigid air to come much further south than it's ever come before.
Very interesting. Judith Ott asked, please talk about advantages of producing energy and food locally, jobs, community, energy, efficient delivery, economy, etc.
Yeah, Judy, that's a really good one. And we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about what we can do ourselves as farmers, as homeowners, as consumers. And one of the things we want to encourage is subscribing to local farms, particularly local farms that use regenerative agriculture. We have several out on Vermont Road where we live here in Punta Gorda, and on Long Island, the Golden Earthworm is a farm, a local farm that uses regenerative agriculture and is also producing very healthy food. Yeah, Judy, it's really a great multiplier because you are not transporting food a long ways. If you use the people who participate in silvopasture and regenerative agriculture and they're local, you're getting really high quality food that's sequestering a lot of carbon and they're not emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, and you're getting healthy food and it's making you healthy. It's a win-win situation. And that may seem like a short answer, but we'll talk some more about that next week also, Judy, because there's some good decisions to be made by that at the individual level. Thank you.
We have 3 minutes left, 2 questions and 2 comments. So the first question is from George Girardi, and he asks, is electric usage for home, autos, and power grids good for the environment? Is electric usage good?
Yes and no. We want to make sure we're using, it depends where the power is where the electricity is coming from, and it depends on how efficient it is. So in the case of somebody who is using baseboard electric heat and getting his electricity or her electricity or their electricity from the regular power grid, let's say PSE&G, where 80% of it is being supplied by greenhouse gas emitting fuels, that's not particularly a good way to go. The baseboard electric heat is very inefficient, and you're using a lot of electricity, and it is putting a lot of emissions in the air. The goal to electrify everything and power it with zero emission energy is what we want to achieve. And we want to do that in an efficient way. So we don't want to be using baseboard heat. We want to be using, for example, high efficiency heat pumps, which use maybe a third the amount of energy. And then what's coming in your house from the pole or underground electric is coming from sources that are not emitting energy. That, as we pointed out, we want to be generating electricity from wind, onshore and offshore, from solar farms, from geothermal, from nuclear power, and the like. So yes and no, George. Depends where it's coming from and depends how efficient it is. Good question.
Okay. Imad Kayali asks, on the subject of trees and reforestation, where do we stand on cutting down trees during Christmas and bulldozing Palestinians' olive trees to build illegal settlements? Are environmentalists having anything to say on that?
Well, I think two radically different approaches. The tree farms, sustainably grown Christmas trees that I've seen are actually not a criminal in this case. The trees are grown in a way that they're sequestering carbon for their whole life. They're not dug up. When they're cut down, they're not dug up. All this carbon is staying in the soil. The only carbon that we're losing to the atmosphere is the biomass in the tree itself if that tree gets burned instead of disposed of properly. So responsible forestry is a pretty good partner. Bulldozing olive trees could make me cry. Not just for it's bad enough for the people who own the land, who's having it robbed from them, but the idea of bulldozing any tree is taking all that carbon that used to be stored in the soil and releasing it back into the atmosphere. It's deforestation. And this is my opinion. I think it's a criminal act, but everybody's doing it. There are developments around the corner from our house here where they had beautiful native forests, and we'll talk about this some more when we talk about government and the responsibility for development. Why do you go and rip down trees that have been there for hundreds of years and rip them out of the soil, release all the carbon, and then pile them in a big pile and then set it on fire to burn them and send all that more carbon to the atmosphere? I mean, it's just an invitation for disaster. Bulldozing olive trees is criminal, in my opinion. And I'm sorry people are experiencing that.
Okay, Susan Zott asks, what kind of backup is there for solar farms when there is bad weather like Texas is having now?
Right, that's a really good question. And there's been a lot of talk about this on the news lately. I mean, the wisecrack answer or the short-term answer would be the same thing that you'd say, well, what about my solar on my house if we lose electricity, if somebody cuts the grid off? The technical solution is to have a battery backup. In other words, have solar and battery so that the system is self-supporting. And that's not far from being reality. The cost of solar power, including battery backup, battery storage, is in a lot of places in the country compatible with fossil fuels. Of course, it takes a long time to build those things. So ultimately, for a standalone system, to have the battery backup is what you want to have. But the grid, the electric grid, should rely on various sources of electricity. Wind, solar. Of course, wind and solar are both constrained in terms of when the sun shines and when the wind blows. Nuclear is not. Geothermal is not. And the other situation that was raised on the news, the big problem in Texas is not the kind of fuel, it's the fact that the grid is not backed up. We don't have a grid, as I understand it, we don't have a national grid that's tied in so that if we have a problem, for example, in Texas, where basically everything froze. Solar was shut down, the wind turbines were frozen, the natural gas plants shut down, the pipelines were frozen so they couldn't get even oil or other fuels to run. The grid was not tied into other parts of the country that could back them up. So we, in addition to having a situation where we need to increase the generation of electricity by bringing non-emitting energy sources online, but we also need a grid that's tied in for backup from geographic region to geographic region. And my understanding is that our grid is very weak in that area as well.
Thank you. And Judith Ott asks, is there a way to share this with the Biden-Harris team? Seriously.
Yes, certainly. Judy, you and I can write a letter. We'll send it to them. The Biden-Harris team has a lot of this in mind from my reading of their plan, which I started reading 4 or 5 months ago. There's a lot of impediments to getting what they're talking about done. But for example, the Biden-Harris team has a big push for replacing fossil fuels with zero emission fuels. They have a big push for, and this is very heartening to me, for conservation measures to form, say, a conservation corps that takes people out of poverty and gives them jobs planting trees. There's a lot of what we talked about today is in the Biden-Harris plan, at least on my first reading of it.
Okay, and we have two comments to share. The first from Gerald Larson. He says, in a workshop we attended at Patel College of Global Sustainability, a presenter addressed using organic waste to produce methane gas utilizing a methane digester.
Okay.
And the next comment also from Gerald is, decaying organic matter will release CO2 and methane naturally into the environment, which appears to be a net zero addition of CO2 and methane to the atmosphere while providing an energy source, i.e. methane gas. Since naturally decaying matter can produce CO2 and methane, the methane digester step seems to have an environmental benefit.
Thank you, Jerry.
And that concludes the questions and comments.
Okay, quick here on what's coming next. Next week, we will talk about specific actions, who does what, as opposed to what we want to achieve. How can we achieve the things we talked to today in our own realms, in our own businesses, our own homes, our houses of worship, our farms? So that's what's next. You will get a email tomorrow night that will have some homework. There'll be a quiz on what we covered tonight. There'll also be a reminder to register for session 4. You could register for session 5 if you want to. They'll also, in that email, will show you where to get to the references if you want to look at some of, for example, the details of what drawdown is suggesting for some of these means. There's some links to those. There'll be a copy of the slideshow. And I was hoping there would be a recording of the webinar, but I just noticed I didn't turn the recording on until about 75% of the way through tonight. So we won't have a recording for the whole show for tonight. So, and if you don't want to wait for the email, you can just go to the tinyurl.com with Greta, and you can see all that stuff at your convenience. And with that, we'll wish everybody good night. Thank you for attending, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Good night.
Night.